June that I'll reveal another time. But it gives me great pleasure to welcome Hugh today. He's Professor of Ecology and Maths at the University of Queensland, and there's a whole range of accolades. I think some of them, some of his history is on the cover, so I won't go into them, but mentioning a few of them, he was instrumental in developing the MarkSand software, which I saw on Wikipedia has been described as Australia's biggest single contribution to conservation biology.
I wrote that, so it must be true.
You don't have to write your own Wikipedia entries. Yeah.
Well, there's ways.
He also was former chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy, and recently he was chief scientist for the government of Queensland as well. So, and many other things beyond that. So thanks Hugh for coming over, and also you're in for a treat. It's old school, only verbal and flip charts, no slides.
That's right. Thanks, Eugene. Thank you very much. Thanks for asking me along, and thanks for all the people I've already met during the course of the last couple of days. This is technically a holiday for my lovely wife Karen and I. We turned up in Oxford on September the 30th, 1984. So we're recreating that trip. It involved many weeks in Europe, and then turning up in September 30th, 1984, it was 30 degrees Celsius in Oxford as I started my PhD. And I thought, that's not bad. People complain about the British. This is the only thing I'm going to say about the British weather and British culture. We turned up, it was 30 degrees, the grass was brown. We thought, why do they complain about the British weather? Anyway, we were here for 2 years and 8 months. The weather never got to 30 degrees again. So we had trips to Spain and Egypt, which is the best thing about the United Kingdom, because you can get to Spain and Egypt really, really quickly, which you can't do from Australia. Of course, the warning is, being Australian, if I say something that sounds like an A, it's probably an E. If I say something that sounds like an E, it's probably an I. If I say something that sounds like an I, it's probably an A. But none of that made any sense, because the A's sounded like E's to you. And you can write down a little diagram and try and translate. Those of you who had the pleasure of listening to talks by the late Bob May, who was the representative of Australia in Oxford University, may well be able to translate in Australians. But other than that, hopefully, there'll be a text version somewhere else. I do speak too quickly, and I make no apology for that. I'm just going to speak quickly. I'm going to talk about a lot of stories about not really academic stories, not really science stories. I'm going to talk about how throughout my career, from a very early age, I've been working on policy on the side. So at the moment, I sit on 30 boards and committees outside my 3 jobs. And most of my career, I've sit on boards and committees in NGOs, governments, local, state and federal, working on advocacy. Now, I must admit, for that entire time as an academic, and then also in the public service and also working for an NGO, the Nature Conservancy, everybody said every time I joined another government committee, I was wasting my time. So point number 1, you are not wasting your time joining government committees, advisory groups, the World Wildlife Fund and so forth, because 80% of the 800 papers I've co-authored have been inspired by problems I got sitting on committees. I would say 80% of all those publications, all those PhDs that I've supervised, which is 95, postdocs and so forth, have largely been inspired by me listening not very patiently, to the problems that policymakers and managers have at all levels of government in Australia, New Zealand, and all around the world, South Africa, Canada, America. And then we're trying to work out what science, what economics, and what models and maths they need to help make better decisions. So that's my life. So it was never, superficially, it often seemed like a waste of time. In the long run, it never was. I'd also colour those statements before I tell those stories by the fact that I come from a place of enormous privilege. So as an Australian, massively overeducated, white, cis male, who has probably had every possible advantage you can have in life. I was here as a Rhodes Scholar. I've never had to worry about money. These privileges are not given to everybody. So I was running the Federal Biodiversity Committee when I was 33. was a professor and a head of school when I was 32, and 90% of that is just birthright, nothing else. We've got 90% birthright, 99% luck, 0.9% hard work, and 0.1% skill, I would say. So it's all very easy to say all those things and be somewhat apologetic, but also much of the last part of my career and the rest of my career is trying to reverse all those privileges that I've had and make sure that everybody shares them. So there's no point acknowledging privilege and disadvantage and inequities across the scientific world and the policy world. You've got to try and work out how to do as much as you can to do that. To that end, for example, I'm co-chairing the International Conservation Congress for Conservation Biology, which will be in Brisbane June 15 to 20 next year, and making enormous efforts to make it as language general as possible. So we have Tatsuya Maro trying to work on how we can make sure it be language inclusive. One of my tricks in organising conferences is I allow people to submit abstracts and then I randomly assign them to posters, speed talks or real talks. And that really annoys some old white men when they get allocated a poster. I'm the famous name so-and-so, how can I do a poster? I said, well, posters are often better than talks. Anyway, if you do the random allocation system, it's quite equitable because so many things are inequitable. So what can we all do? What are the tricks and tools we can use to reverse those inequities? And the only other rider I would say also is that only one thing you need to know about Australian politics is that our states, in terms of resource management, are probably far more important than our federal government. So I know here the British government dominates a lot of issues around biodiversity and conservation and resource use, and then you go straight down to major councils. We have councils, we have states. The national park system is, for example, not run by the national government, it's run by the states. Vegetation management policy, threatened species investments are run by states. So much of what I'll talk to, more so than the United States. So much of what I talk about is state-based politics. And you say, why would I care about what happens in an Australian state? Well, here is a perfect 1 to 437,000 map of Australia. It may not be recognisable. This is because it's not a Mercator projection. This is a Peters projection, clearly. But the little place that we live in, Queensland, that is the 15th biggest country in the world. 15th biggest, just behind Mexico and Indonesia. 1,000 threatened species, probably as much biodiversity as all of Europe. Only has 5 million people in it. So although while those people are generally relatively wealthy, it's an enormous problem. It goes from lowland rainforest to temperate to desert. So I work with each of these Australian states, but it's a battle by battle proposition, state by state. But it's worthwhile, I suppose, because you're dealing with such a huge fraction. Indonesia has the greatest number of endemic species of any country in the world. Australia has the second greatest number of endemic species of any country in the world. Now, a lot of people think Australia's doing a reasonable job in conservation. They are not. We have very good conservation science. About 10% of all the science, high-profile science in conservation comes from Australia, which is sort of remarkable, 10%. But we are losing a vertebrate every 3 years, a bird every 10 years, a mammal every 10 years, a reptile or frog every 10 years. It's a pretty massive rate of extinction for what you would consider to be a developed, wealthy, I dare say civilized country, maybe not. So we're sort of in a mess. Why are we in a mess? Because we have a tax base of 25 million people trying to look after 10% of the world's biodiversity, and we're overrun with feral organisms. And we also sometimes have a government in place that isn't so interested in biodiversity and conservation. So it's a continuous struggle. I don't think we have as much alignment around conservation as the United Kingdom does. I'm going to go to the punchlines. From all these committees and all these interventions and all this attempts for science to change conservation, I'll give you a few stories that are abject failures, some that are marginal successes, and some that look like failures that became successes and vice versa. The lessons are lots of things take a lot of time. You never really know when it's going to work. So a lot of our work around the world has been conservation planning. That spatial planning tool that you've mentioned, that Ian Ball and I created in the early 1990s, nobody used it for 10 years. Nobody used it. The Nature Conservancy used it a little bit. It's now used by half the countries in the world to build their protected area systems. But Australia doesn't use it. So where it came from doesn't use it. There's no prospect of Australia using it because it came from Australia, so it must be useless, right? That makes sense, doesn't it? So when those tools get used, so people build spatial plans to roll out protected areas, one of the biggest things at the moment is 30 by 2030. Every country is meant to come up with a plan to protect 30% of every ecosystem across the entire nation. Most of those countries will use zonation or C-plan or our tool MarkSand to build those protected area systems. Much of that will go into report, and most of it will not be used for multiple years. But the fact that it doesn't get used in the next 5 years or 10 years, there are these little windows in time when suddenly the stars align. Some senior bureaucrats, some politicians suddenly think, oh, we should do this. Oh, look, there was this plan. They'll redo it again, but they'll basically use the old plan and things happen. So you just have to be incredibly patient. Turn up to everything that anybody asks you to do. Work with everybody. So my other advice. Politicians are hardworking people that mean well. Public servants are hardworking people that mean well. They may not have exactly your value system. Never play the person, always play the ball. So the other thing I've learned, and I'll give you some horrible examples soon, about contentious conservation issues is every now and then somebody gets personal. So one of my great joys, I'll start off with this, is there's an island off the coast of South Australia. Yeah, I was born there. Karen was born there too, in Adelaide. Who's been to Adelaide? Yeah. It's the Athens of the South. You've never been? Unbelievable. So much culture. There's an island there that's 100 kilometres and it's by 40 kilometres, a big island. It's called Kangaroo Island. And somebody put some koalas there in 1924, 100 years ago. Actually, yeah, exactly 100 years ago, somebody put some koalas there, the professor of zoology, because he thought that they were going extinct on the mainland of Australia. They weren't particularly. They are sort of a bit now, but they weren't. And he put them there and he put some other things like gang cockatoos and brush turkeys and platypuses on this island. It's a big island, right? Very big island. And about 1998, I was asked as a young professor to resolve the problem that now, having put 20 koalas on this island, in 1998, there were 25,000 koalas on the island. 20 became 25,000 on an island. And they were killing the trees they lived on. Koalas eat eucalypt leaves, and they eat specific eucalypt leaves. And there were trees that the only leaves on the trees were a thin halo around the top of the tree, because koalas are quite chunky for an arboreal marsupial. They can't get to the tips. And so you actually had a sort of a ball, a globe of little yellow leaves, and all the middle was eaten out. So we were looking forward to a mass death of koalas, and I was asked to take on a committee that I chaired. We did a multi-criteria decision analysis, and we went into this process of how do we solve the koala problem on Kangaroo Island? What are you going to do when there's no predator eating them? What are you going to do with these koalas? So what did I learn? I learned that despite how much economic science and rational thought you can bring into play, that public opinion and policy and politicians will almost never do what you want. So this is the first and most abject of failure, where I stuck my head in the noose and I did 350 interviews in a year and a half, because our committee concluded that we should go and shoot them. Why did we say go and shoot them? Well, can you think of a better solution? Chlamydia. Yes, introduce a disease. Somebody wanted to introduce a top predator, and I thought the only thing that climbs trees could be a leopard. Could be controversial. Put a leopard in Australia. Yeah, could take them out. Other diseases. In the end, the amazing thing is, having got a committee of animal welfare people, conservationists, farmers, local, did a big multi-criteria decision analysis where we looked at all the options, plant more trees. We did have introduced chlamydia, a disease, and all the consequences. The only one that made any sense was to shoot them. But in the end, it's interesting that it doesn't matter how much sense it makes and how rational it is, you can't shoot koalas. Because even after 350 interviews over a year and a half, 90% of South Australians thought that shooting koalas is the only logical solution. This is South Australia, the 28th biggest country in the world. In Sydney, 40% of people thought you should shoot koalas. By the time you got to Tokyo, nobody thought you should shoot koalas. And when we released our report and recommended shooting 20,000 koalas, it was the 3rd page of the Washington Post. It was 2nd page of Le Monde. And the week before we released that, we had Chelsea Clinton in Australia, in Sydney, at Taronga Zoo, cuddling a koala, the most powerful man in the world at that time's daughter, you remember? And we had Michael Jackson cuddling a koala. Won't say any more about that. So the most powerful icon, popular icon in the entire world. And so we said, shoot 20,000 koalas. Never happened, of course. What did they do? They caught them, which is cruel, takes 3 or 4 hours, very expensive. They sterilise them in a caravan and they translocate them down here where they died in 6 months, sterilised and translocated. So they chose an option that was useless and expensive and cruel. And I did so many interviews where somebody said to you, I said, we think we should shoot them. And they said, and we have an 11-member unanimous committee from all sectors saying we should shoot them. And they'd say, isn't that cruel? And I'd say, what do you understand by cruel? Anyway, it doesn't really matter because by then the interview was over, because they'd always got a picture of me from the bottom looking at my nose and I looked like I was evil, and they took out quotes that they'd made up. And so that was my biggest first entree into public policy, and it was a disaster. But if nothing else, it thickened my skin. So 0-1, right? 0 Hugh, 0 science, 1 irrational, weird politics. Second example, at the same time we were working on the forests of Victoria, and I was working closely with David Lindenmayer. Actually, it's an interesting story because native forest logging in Australia is coming close to an end. Western Australia has just banned it. Victoria's just banned it. But at this point in time, all through the 80s and 90s, the biggest conservation issue in Australia was logging, native forest logging. And some of the most iconic forests in Australia are called mountain ash forests. They're not an ash. We like to name all our eucalypts after European trees, even though we have oaks that aren't oaks, and we have these trees are the tallest flowering tree in the world. They grow 1.5 meters a year. They can get to, the biggest ones may have been 90 meters high. Incredible forests, incredibly valuable. And the arguments we're having were not unlike those of you who have followed some of the early US conservation in Oregon, Northern California, Washington, around the northern spotted owl and the huge temperate forests there, which are incredibly valuable timber forests. And David Lindenmayer had spent his life working, well, to that point, has spent much of his life since then working on leadbeater's possum and other forest fauna, studied them, and we did lots of population models to help the forest industry decide what should be done to these forests. So we were brought in by the federal government. Federal government said, we're sick of all these forest wars. There's people up in trees, there's people putting metal bolts in trees, there's people being arrested, there's fights. And that has actually gone on for 20 or 30 years, and it's just basically coming to an end now. Tasmania is still a bit of a problem. So I didn't even put Tasmania on the map of Australia. Oops, hope nobody from Tasmania, they get very offended by that. So yes, so there's blob here that says mountain ash is really now Tasmania. They're still fighting about forests. So we thought science could be brought to bear on this issue. So what do? I was trained as a mathematician. What can I do? I can just model. So I built lots of population models for leadbeater's possum. We had a simple question. What changes could we make to forest management in this area that would ensure the viability of this tiny little possum called Lesbita's possum, which actually disappeared for about 80 years. It was rediscovered in 1962, having disappeared. And then, you know, there were maybe a few thousand left in this particular forest type that David had been studying. We did thousands of models. I killed millions of Leadbeater's possum in my computer, running multiple simulations, and I tested different rotation times. Should we log the mountain ash trees when they're 30? What if we logged them when they're 50? Maybe that gives them a better chance. What if we had some small reserves? What if we made better connectivity? What if we improved fire management in the system? What if we stop salvage? Salvage logging is when the fire comes through, you actually go and log it and take out the timber that has recently burned. What if we didn't do that? So we looked at all these options and we ended up realizing that regardless of what you did, we could prove that the probability of extinction of Leadbeater's possum is exactly a number between 0 and 1, which is the probability of anything. So we actually, why? Because most Australian fauna, we don't have enough data to do accurate population modelling. So that was my cathartic moment when I suddenly embraced decision science, having been in a maths department, taught all this optimization that I hated, learned a lot of economics that I didn't understand. I suddenly realized all this optimization in economics is very useful. And in fact, what conservation biology at that time had been doing was trying to model things that were unmodelable. Because whether or not Leadbeater's possum goes extinct or not is very much determined by tiny changes in adult mortality rate and dispersal, which we knew nothing about, and we probably would never know anything about because you would never have enough data. You know, this country has more people studying blue tits than we have ecologists. Now, that's an exaggeration, but in the end, you know, we have this huge diversity, a lot more diversity than the whole of Europe, and we have 25 million people, and we just don't know enough about the autoecology of almost any species to be able to build actual population models. But what I did learn with Mick McCarthy and Sandy Annam and other people is that even though we couldn't work out what forest management should happen to save the possum, we could work out what was the best thing to do. But that doesn't make any sense, does it? So what does that mean? It means that we could tell them that, in fact, changing the rotation time did very little for the same economic cost, but putting in a small reserve system with 50-hectare reserves with some connectivity where there was fire breaks between those reserves, which are through Notophagous forest, that gave the species the best chance to save itself. So if we did that, it had the best chance it would have, we just didn't know what that chance was. So in the end, it's actually like many things in life, you don't know, you can't guarantee anything will happen, but you can work out using models what is the best thing to do. And that result, that small reserves of 50 hectares is much better than rotation times changing, is resistant to huge variability in parameters. Huge variability in parameters. So then it made me realise that resolving uncertainty is not about making models better, it's making decisions better. And decisions can be resilient to enormous, the best decision is often resilient to enormous amounts of variability in underlying parameters. And you often need to know many, many things, more so than the actual final result. And then I started to become an economist. I've failed to become an economist because I don't understand any of the words they say. But I try and think like an economist, which created the rest of my career, which sort of partly started in Imperial College in 1994 on study leave, when I suddenly realised that conservation kept making models, but they weren't making decision science models. They weren't putting their models in the context of economic constraints and optimization problems. So that basically set the rest of my career. We built reserve design software and so forth. Did that actually happen? Well, they did actually build the reserve systems we did, but unfortunately also they broke a lot of the rules in the forestry operations. And then we had massive fires in Australia. Was it 2009, 2013 that burned a lot of these forests, which is more or less what I said before, right? Even if you do exactly the right thing, if you have these gigantic fires and wiped out a lot of their habitat. So the Leadbeater possums are not doing very well. They may or may not survive, and now the logging is about to stop. Maybe we stopped too late, but we had some impact on policy for a short amount of time. All that process also lent us to build some reserve design software, which we eventually called MarkSan. What is MarkSan? It's a piece of software that solves a straightforward and simple problem: protect at least 20 or 30% of every kind of habitat and every kind of species in a well-connected system that annoys as few people as possible. So that's the MarkSan problem. And we built that for the forest reserve system. By the time we built it and it was being used, they didn't use it. So it was a waste of time. 95, 96, 97, 98. 1998, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. Where's the Great Barrier Reef? It's an area that's like that, Great Barrier Reef. It's, you know, they call us the world's biggest reef. What a stupid thing to say, really. It's 5,000 reefs. It's not the world's biggest reef, but it's an area size of Italy. And in 1995, if you were alive and if I'd asked you and said, what do you think the Great Barrier Reef is? You would say, oh, that's the world's biggest coral reef marine reserve. And that would have been a lie, because only 5% was protected from fishing. 5% of the entire Great Barrier Reef was protected from fishing. And we happened to have a federal environment minister called Robert Hill under a right-wing government, under the Howard government, and he was determined to leave a legacy for nature. He created the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which is our first piece of endangered species legislation that still happens today. Partially successful, and I helped him do that. He also wanted to build Australia's marine protected area system, and he said, we'll start with the Great Barrier Reef. And the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority came to me and said, you know a bit about reserve design. Also, Bob Pressey, the late Bob Pressey, they came to him and said, you know a bit about reserve design. Can you help us build a protected area system for all of Eastern Australia, or the whole Great Barrier Reef? And we said, yes. We talked, we had lots of meetings. It got a bit frustrating because they said, well, MarkSan, you made that for forests. That one, sorry, it was called SpecSan then. SpecSan, that software you made, that was for forests. That won't work in the ocean because marine ecology is completely different from terrestrial ecology, isn't it? Nothing like it. And I said, what's the problem that MarkSan solves? Protect 20% of every or 30% of every species, distribution, habitat in a well-connected way that minimises impact on other users. That's all it does. That's the only problem it solves. That works in the land and the sea. So then I said, okay, we'll go away and we'll fix it. We'll make it work for the sea. And we did nothing. We renamed it. And we renamed it from SpecSan to MarkSan. And then they said, now it works on the sea. And I said, good. So that was a success. And they ran it and they did it. And July 1st, 2004, we probably got one of the most representative reserve systems that ever been created in the world, because the Great Barrier Reef was rezoned. But from 4.7% protected, it went to 33% protected. And this is the amazing, it's not that it was 33% protected. That's not exciting from fishing. The exciting thing is 20 of 70 mappable ecosystem types, every one was 20% protected or more. Every one was 20% protected or more. And if you know anything about protected areas in the world and anything about protected areas on the land or the sea, you know they are massively underrepresented. Countries will claim that they've conserved 20% of their nation, and you'll find it's the deserts, it's the rocky hills, it's the infertile soils. Who can claim they've conserved 20% of every habitat? Mongolia used MarkSan, and they actually achieved that sort of outcome, but it's extremely rare. So it was representation. So that was, in some sense, a great success. And you think, oh, Australia knows what they're doing. They have all these people who do spatial planning, like Bob Pressey and Chris Margills. They have all these tools. Robert Hill, the federal minister, said, let's do it for the whole continent. Did they use any systematic conservation planning tools? No, they used none. They decided to contract some expert consultants. And for example, here, this part of the world is called the Kimberleys. It's vast. It's again, that area of sea would be the size of France. They built a reserve system. They've conserved 10% of it. And of that huge area up there, in this is Timor and Indonesia over here, East Timor and Indonesia, they made a protected area system that was about 8%. They made a little couple of things there. What do you think that 8% they conserved was? They conserved all the abyssal plain The abyssal plain. What is the abyssal plain? It's stuff that's 2,000 metres deep. This is all shelf. And what do you do on shelves? 50 metres? Well, you fish it, and what's here? Gas and oil. And so the federal government's going, so we made this fabulous reserve system and we conserved all the abyssal plains and we did not build a representative reserve system. That is extremely typical of what, I would expect a country that had no scientific expertise, no marine mapping, and no will to do the right thing would do that, and Australia managed to do it. And they ticked the box of 10% reserve system, and even now they're not embarrassed. They did slightly better in some places, they see slightly worse in other places, but the fact that they refused to use any systematic planning tools, they refused to set objectives, and they were completely, I thought actually we were arguing between conservation and fishing. We weren't. They refused to put any protected area anywhere near where somebody could get a little bit of oil or a little bit of gas. That was around about 2011. And they're still pretty much like that. Australia is the second biggest exporter of fossil fuels in the entire planet. So there you go. Great Barrier Reef rezoning is now used as a model all around the world. It's probably the most enlightened 20-year-old rezoning of any protected area system in the entire world, copied by countries all over the world. Australia then messes up the entire rest of the entire continent. Some of the states in state waters did a good job using spatial planning tools, but federally we did a very poor job. So knowledge doesn't really always get you anywhere. Around about the same time, 1998, I was in a nice meeting on threatened species with Mark Bergman, who was a conservation scientist, and we were advising the federal government about how they should spend money on recovery plans. So we have 2,000 threatened species in Australia. Oh, change flip charts. You know where Australia is now, so it's good. We have 2,000 threatened species, a lot, which is probably as many as the United States or Europe. We don't have a lot of money. And at that point in time, we have critically endangered species, and most of them got some recovery planning money. Endangered species, generally not, a little bit. Vulnerable species, never. Near threatened, zero. And I was at this meeting and I was thinking a bit about it, and I'd read some papers by some economists on threatened species funding and triage. And I said, well, really, what if one of these critically endangered species is going to cost you, say, $20 million to save? And I think for most plants in Australia, 60% of our 2,000 listed species are plants, of which half are orchids. I could save one for $100,000 with community help. Seeds, seed banks, Kew gardens, whatever. $100,000 I can save a plant. Do you want to save this very difficult to save threatened bird or mammal that's going to cost you $20 million, or do you want to save 200 plants? Who's for the plants? Who's for the, well, we'll call this northern herring-nosed wombat, very sexy mammal. The biggest fossorial mammal in the world, 30-kilogram hole-digging mammal. Who wants to save the northern herring-nosed wombat? Yeah. So we're, difficult problem. But they just said, Hugh, how dare you go out of the room? You're a crazy academic. We won't listen to you. You're saying triage. You're talking about triage, and they call it triage. I love calling it triage because that's evil. And I said it's a simple formula, and Mark supported me a bit. What's the cost effectiveness of any project? Cost effectiveness of any project is the expected benefit, which is the improvement in the extinction probability times the probability of success of this project divided by the cost of the project. Why don't we just take their 2,000 threatened species, work out a project for each species, what's the chance it works, what's the improvement in the extinction rate divided by the cost, put them on an Excel spreadsheet. This is not complicated modelling, right? This is not even complicated economics. I don't even think this is first year economics. It's below first year economics. And do that and say, you're crazy. And then some states said to me, why is your formula any better than our formula? We've got a good formula. We just give every species 7 different scores for its life history and whether it nests on the ground. And one of the scores was how much it costs. And one of the scores was probability of success. And I said, what's 50% plus $20 million? What's 50% plus $20 million? What's 3 kilograms plus 2 meters? Don't they educate people here, Yavinda? Nobody knows what 3 kilograms plus 2 meters is. But I suddenly realised that most government and NGO prioritisation schemes or actions involve taking that action, giving it scores on a number of criteria, and some of those scores are cost scores, some of them are probability of success scores, some of them are different outcome scores for people or nature, or carbon or climate change, and you turn everything into a number out of 10 and you add them all up. EJ and I have a paper on this. And we've probably now had 150 papers on this. Governments still make decision making based on adding arbitrary numbers out of 10 together. And it makes no sense because I think, hopefully, even most people did enough physics to know you can't add 3 kilograms to 2 meters. Anyway, so they would say, this is where the test of patient comes in when you're dealing with government committees, is they'd say, why is your formula any better than our formulas? And I'd say, first of all, I just get angry. And then I'd say, my formula's right. And then I'd say, I'm a professor of maths. Doesn't matter. All of those don't work. Doesn't work at all. I then tried to work out, this is shopping. So I'd tell a story about if you go into 2 supermarkets and one place you can get 3 kilograms of rice for $2, and another place you get 4 kilograms of rice for $3. What do? You get the one that's most cost effective, the one that gives you the most kilograms per dollar. That's how you buy rice if you want a roll of rice, okay? Assuming rice all tastes the same. So there's 1 billion people in the world, literally 1 billion people in the world every day using that formula to buy stuff from the highlands of New Guinea to Patagonia to everywhere in the world. But for some reason, most government agencies and NGOs refuse to use that formula, or even variations on that formula. And of course, you can expand that out to cost utility analysis. You can expand it out to multi-criteria decision analysis, all those logical approaches. So I lost. So what do you do if you're an academic and nobody listens to you? You write papers. So I wrote papers, and Liana Joseph did a PhD with me, and she wrote a great series of papers on project prioritisation for threatened species, which people in New Zealand read. They apparently do understand numbers, and they said, we're going to do it. And so they've actually implemented this, and they were the first implementers of this approach, and then New South Wales had implemented. So yes, failure, partial success. Interestingly, we've worked in the United States, we've worked in other places, probably is not so useful in a lot of countries in Europe, and because you don't have to do triage. You can pretty well save everything, right? But remember, the economy of New Zealand is about 1/1000th of the economy of Europe, and they have as much biodiversity to save as you have in terms of endemic species. 1/1000th of the economy. Okay, so everybody else other than Europe and some of North America has to adopt a triage approach. And in fact, everybody has to prioritise, because who here has an infinite life and who here has infinite money? So you're all prioritising all the time. But it is amazing, even now, I get people fighting me about prioritisation. They say quantitative prioritisation is evil. Anyway, so partial success. I'm going to tell a couple more quick stories. Oh, I have not much time. How much time have I got? 10 more minutes? 10 or 15 minutes? That illustrate different points. This is one of my favourite ones, actually. Biodiversity offsetting. Biodiversity offsetting. Well, who here feels familiar with biodiversity offsetting? Somewhat familiar? Basically, what's the old offsetting? In Australian law, the old offsetting policy for biodiversity was, here's 100 hectares of a particular habitat type. I'm a developer. I want to turn that into houses or a coal mine. I can wipe that out. And the quality of that habitat was very good, 1.0, 100%. How do I compensate? Well, the old rules was, well, if you took, say, 200 hectares of 0.5 quality habitat and you protected that, that's the same amount of habitat area times quality, 200 times, still 100 points. That was the old offsetting. And Martine Marin, Sarah Beckersey, myself, Megan Evans, Brendan Wintle, we said that's not very good. That's a good way of destroying half of everything. That's not really off. It's not definitely not no net loss, is it? You just destroy this and you put this in a national park. It all depends how much this was being destroyed in the first instance. So surely we should compensate. So a better one would be, in fact, okay, you need to conserve that and you need to take that from 0.5 up to 1.0. And then you're compensating for the nature you've lost. Of course, there's a problem because it might not work. There's a problem because it takes a long time. And then there's about 150 papers written on why biodiversity offsetting does or doesn't work. So we had some centres funded by the federal government around about 2008 to 2012 or 2018. And in those centres that I ran, we started working on biodiversity offsetting. And the government said to us, don't work on that. No, don't. So even though they were funding us and we were doing co-design, remember we were all meant to do co-design, right, aren't we? So we work with the end users and we do the science that they need. They said, don't do it. And we ignored them because we said, we think that this system you're using is rubbish. And in a few years' time, you'll come to us wanting a better system. They don't want to know about it. So we just did it. We wrote the papers. That's what we do. Series of papers, Brendan, Sarah, other people here wrote these papers. And then suddenly another group of public servants appeared and they rang up Martine Marin and said, can you make us a national biodiversity offset calculator that's logical in 3 months? And she said, well, that's going to be really difficult. I'm not sure. Then they rang me up and said, can you do it in 3 months? And I said, not sure. So I said to Martine, can we do this? And she said, oh, they've contacted me, blah, blah, blah. And they gave us all of $15,000 and we employed Megan Evans and we made a biodiversity offset calculator that actually did a reasonable job of doing all this stuff. We took their spreadsheet, which was full of arbitrary weightings and arbitrary scores to do all this work, and we kept the colour scheme. There was burnt orange and there was olive and there was a light blue. And we had 3 linked spreadsheets. So we kept the colour scheme and we gave it back to them and said, oh, that's good. You've just tweaked the system. We said, yeah, we tweaked the system. Nothing about the system was the same. We kept the colour scheme. And we delivered them a national biodiversity offset scheme that's for the entire federal government that probably runs through $200 or $300 million a year for $15,000 of consulting. And they use it. That was a success. What's the point of that story? The point of that story is, yes, you should talk to governments and industry about what they need now, but what they think they need now is usually something they need in the next year, sadly. You need to think, what are they going to ask me in 5 years' time, and do the work then. And even though they say they don't want you to work on it or they won't fund it, use some other source of money to do that work. And suddenly then they suddenly want it and then you deliver it to them in a ridiculously stupid short amount of time. So that was sort of a success. And that actually, those calculators were used for over a decade. They're just being redone in the federal government to create our offset schemes, and they've been used in other countries. And credit to Martine and Megan, Sarah and others who worked on that offset calculator for a long time. So I suppose, yes, I know that as academics, we're all told, get in there, do co-design. Sometimes you've just got to listen, and sometimes you've got to listen, go away and do what you need to do. Get PhD students to do it. In my case, usually and then get it done so it's ready to roll out. The final one, I'll tell you a story, which I think is, I'll try and end on a happy story, right? Happy story. Biggest problem in Australia in the environment has probably been land clearing. When Karen and I moved to Queensland from South Australia, largely moved there because the state we're in, South Australia, had cleared all its agricultural land, destroyed it down to 5 or 10% of remnant vegetation. That's why I became a conservationist, because I was so upset by land clearing. But Queensland was clearing 500,000 hectares a year. That put the state of Queensland up there near Brazil in terms of habitat destruction every year, year after year. 10% of Australia's greenhouse gases. And I got there, I worked with the NGOs and the government. They said, Hugh, it's going to take 10 or 20 years for the Queensland government to stop land clearing. So we're losing 500,000 hectares a year, sometimes close to 1 million hectares a year. This will take 20 years. But interestingly, this is the other thing I've learned is, although they're being as an academic, the NGO lobbyists know when to act. And so Barry Traill, who was both an ecologist and working for the Wilderness Society at the time, has said, Hugh, we just need a simple statement, a simple science consensus statement that said land clearing is really, really stupid. It was 2 pages long, they had 20 references, and there was no new science, and we had 500 people sign it. Myself first authored that science with Barry Traill, and we presented it as though the scientists had just come up with this. So, you know, scientists come up with a consensus, and the land clearing statements said things like, if you destroy vegetation, you increase the extinction probability of species. You cause salinity, you cause erosion, you cause CO2 emissions, all these things that everybody had known for 20, 40, 50 years. And I sent that to the Premier of the state and the Prime Minister of Australia. And in a week, Peter Beattie, the Premier of the state, waived it and said, the scientists have agreed land clearing is a bad idea. And within 2 years, land clearing rates have dropped to 50,000 hectares a year, gone down 90%, ninefold, tenfold, gone down tenfold. The equivalent of taking half the cars in Australia off the road. So scientists can do good things. Now, I would not have known how to write that statement. I could gather the evidence, I could draft it. The NGO people know how to write it. They also know when to send it to the right people and how to send it and how to frame it. And then you're lucky. So maybe we had this tiny window of time because people have been complaining about land clearing for years. Had a huge impact. So that was 2005. I thought then, good, I can die. The Great Barrier Reef is rezoned. Land clearing in Queensland has stopped. I did not. It was 20 years ago. Didn't make me very happy. 7 years later, we had a lunatic premier who reversed all the land clearing laws, and the land clearing went up to 500,000 hectares a year. And I've spent the last 10 years doing the same thing yet again, writing the documents, chairing the committees, and the land clearing rates are going down again in a very different way, less about change of legislation. Just that this was a man who not only reversed, Campbell Newman is named, not only reversed land clearing in Queensland, and literally, as I say, increases greenhouse gas emissions in the continent by 10% by one single act of Parliament, where you don't have an upper house. So he did it in 6 weeks of getting into power. He also sacked every single stock assessor in the state. Can you imagine something more anti-science? Why do we have stock assessors for fisheries? What are they doing? Sacked. Took the Department of Primary Industries 10 years to rebuild their stock assessment year. He only stayed in power for 2 or 3 years. He's gone. But the damage that an individual road politician can do is enormous. That said, so you can have, if you pick the time, science consensus statements have a huge impact. They take a bit of time to organise. And Peter Beattie, I spoke to him and he said he didn't realise that everybody agreed on land clearing, because there were a few people in his primary industries department said it was very, very contentious. It wasn't, the science wasn't settled. So having a letter with 500 people sign it, make an enormous matter, a very simple 2-page statement with some scientific references. So that's why I now, one of my jobs is I'm co-chair of the Biodiversity Council, which formed in Australia a year and a half ago, the brilliant idea of Brendan Wintle. That Biodiversity Council of 50 people, our job of 50 scientists is just to do lobbying. We are scientists who lobby on policy. And we're funded not by government. We're funded only by philanthropy. So we're like the mirror of the Climate Council in Australia, and we're trying to tackle issue by issue, and we have great staff. That council is half female, half male, and it's a third First Nations peoples. So it's a third Indigenous Australians on that council. So we've actually organised ourselves a lot better than before, because often in the past, my role was NGOs grabbed the scientist and said, do this, do that. And generally I'm happy to do that. Actually, many of the things that have been most useful is the public servant says, Hugh, could you please do this? I'm a public servant, I can't. And so I do that. So in fact, I'm just obeying, I'm like a puppet for the NGO and the public service movement. But now, the Biodiversity Council, we're having some success in getting through to national policy. So yes, I suppose the take-home message there is most battles take 10 to 15 years. But occasionally they're very quick, and occasionally you win and then you lose again and you have to fight the battle again. But the bottom line is that you can't despair, because I think even though probably I've lost more than I've won, the ones that are worth winning, and it's better than getting nowhere. And we are making progress. I'll leave with one thought, I suppose, an exciting thought for those of you who are interested in environmental and biodiversity markets. Australia's just created a nature repair market as of November last year. I hope to be involved organising and helping that committee and that market roll out, but we are fully involved now in having biodiversity certificates and giving people biodiversity certificates for actions that will ultimately be tradable and valued in a marketplace. Sort of, it's the right-wing economist neoliberal dream of how do you solve the biodiversity conservation problem. 80% of ecologists think it's a waste of time. 80% of ecologists think we'll fail. They are probably right, but I'm stupid enough to want to do it. Just because we've proved time and time again that government spending on the environment in Australia has been going down for 40 years. Philanthropy has moved up a bit, but will probably only ever solve 10 to 20% of the problem. We have to have something to solve the final 80%. And markets, yeah, okay, we better have a go. So that will occupy me probably for the next 2 or 3 years. And I will report back on the successes or failures of that endeavour. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Lots of insight there. So we'll open up to questions from the floor. This is just for the online audience. So there is an online microphone I'll be sharing. Anybody want to kick off with a question?
Oh, brevity caused me to gloss over the truth most of that talk. So, no, that's my excuse.
Very nice and very interesting experience that you mentioned and share. Thank you for that. You mentioned often the cost of conservation, but you never mentioned the cost of non-conservation. And what is that cost for your Australian state, especially recently with the heat and everything? Is that also part of your formula?
Yeah. I mean, it should be, shouldn't it? I mean, the benefits here I'm talking about are often measured in reduced species extinction or increase in the abundance of a threatened species and so forth. But there's all these benefits. There's carbon benefits, there's water quality benefits, there's mental health benefits, and there's just nature tourism benefits. And no, there are many good economists in Australia who have said, you know, the koala alone is worth $2 billion a year to the Australian economy. Cornell just showed that the birdwatching industry in the United States is $260 billion US. Australia has 350 birds. You can't see anywhere else on the planet. All those European and North American bird watchers have to come to Australia. Do we take advantage of that? Do we think about it? 50% of Australian tourism is nature-based tourism? No. So there's people like Katrina are smarter than me, and economists, it's called market failure, I think. You know, we are making so much money out of nature, just direct money out of nature, let alone mental health benefits. You know, you can walk around an Australian city and in an hour you can see 7 species of parrot. You've got an Indian ringneck parrot now, so you should be happy. So you can see 7 species of parrot walking around in half an hour, beautiful trees, enormous diversity. Doesn't matter how many times actually we've done the economic analysis on all these financial benefits of nature, mental health benefits, health, all these things, they never cut through to politics, oddly. The only thing that's starting to cut through more now is 20% of the vote is a Green vote. In the middle of Queensland, arguably the most conservative state in Australia, in the state government, 3 inner city seats went to the Greens. We have preferential voting. So now all the parties have to pay some attention because green preferences are winning government's government. So it's not logic, actually. It's just some version of democracy. I'm not going to say it's really democracy, but it's a version of democracy that is starting to win the environmental wars in Australia. That said, we can't get them to allocate more money. They're doing less damage, but they won't allocate all we need to do the recovery of the species, which we estimate to be around about $4 billion a year. We have just commissioned 8 nuclear submarines, which will cost us $450 billion to defend us against a mythical enemy. $450 billion, where spending. That means we could stop extinctions. We've worked out we could stop extinction in Australia for $4 billion a year. Everybody says that's an outrageous sum of money, but we're willing to spend $450 billion on 8 nuclear submarines, which I assume that this mythical animal will blow up in the first week of any putative war, to be blunt. Anyway, so yes, the argument about allocation of funding and taxation is one we're not winning at the moment, which is why philanthropy is becoming important and why the markets are probably going to be the key. I don't know if anybody's winning the allocation of money to the environment war. Maybe France, I don't know, Germans. Yep.
Hi, my name is Wulan. I'm from your neighboring country, Indonesia.
Yes, the most biodiverse country in the world for endemic species.
Yes. And I work in Sulawesi using your mark sign for my first chapter.
Oh.
So my question is, it's really interesting that you said, so all of that good works that scientists do can be, it can be like just moved back like 5 decades just because like a bad politicians in power just for like 2 years.
Yes.
So if you like have any knowledge at all about our Indonesian new president and past. So as a scientist, when we have these like really challenging politicians, like, having like high political positions, what should we do? Like should we like just like, just a lot of people in Indonesia, especially people that are working in international NGOs, because they're, afraid getting kicked out of the country. Just like, just cover down waiting for the hurricane to pass. But, like, well, you don't know how long
will come again.
Sorry?
The hurricane will come again.
Yes,
Even if it passes, it'll come again. So in Australia, many of the green groups have made their mistake by aligning themselves with the left wing of politics. The green groups continuously align themselves with the left wing of politics. So one thing I regret doing, some things I have successful, I always talk to the right wing of politics, because on average, in a country like Australia, they are in power half the time over the last 100 years. And often we've had our biggest wins from the right wing of politics. I think that's the same true for this particular country. But in other countries, it's not always clear left wing and right wing. You should be always talking to the opposition. If you see an emerging force, you should go in there. I'm a scientist. I care about nature. So you express your value system, you express your skill base. I would like to help you work out how to secure the biodiversity and environment of this nature coming forward, and just ignore politics, regardless of what they're doing. Ignore the politics and try and help them, because you will be the only probably environmentalist talking to them in many cases.
So like acting as an honest broker, basically.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. But honest broker, but you're still expressing your value system. So I'm always clear. I say, I love birds. I love biodiversity. I'm not going to spend days justifying its value to the economy, but, 20% of people in this country care about nature, so people use iNaturalists. The bird watching, the natural history community is booming around the planet. So you can give them data and statistics, even ignoring all the utilitarian values, or the financial utilitarian values of conservation. So I'm just honest about my value system as well. Yeah.
I was just picking up on that point. To what extent should we be working on those intuitive values? I mean, the case of the koalas was one where that worked against you, because that koala being cuddly worked against the rational ecological decision there. But in many cases, can we use those as affinities to nature as being more powerful in the economic arguments and convincing politicians?
Definitely, I think so. I mean, I come to conservation from a natural history. I want to identify bird things. I want to understand ecology. I love flowers and things. But then there's a whole heap of people who just love wilderness or wild areas. I shouldn't call it wilderness, wild areas, or big open spaces, or vast big forests, or big trees, clean rivers. So I think people come with different values, and I just think those values are increasing all the time in almost all countries in the world. Is it Kuznets curve? I don't know, many people have read about Kuznets curve, which says that basically while a country is sorting out how to feed everybody and give them clean water, they tend to destroy the environment. And then once the bottom of Maslow's pyramid is satisfied, then you start thinking about these higher level things. So there's that argument that's where, generally many countries are slowly becoming more prosperous. there are also arguments that some countries actually don't need Kuznets curve, and they go through to, like Costa Rica, valuing the environment well before sorting out the bottom of Maslow's pyramid. So, yeah, I think you've got to play to the. Well, one reason I don't get obsessively involved in United Nations things and global politics is I think much of conservation happens in the country you were grown up in and born in, or the country you spend most of your time in. So that's why in some sense I stopped working for the Nature Conservancy, because I'm thinking Americans don't want to listen to me. People from Kenya and Madagascar and Brazil don't want to listen to an Australian. What do I know about their culture and their politics and their values? So if I'd had my time again, I would have spent more time talking to people in Indonesia. So if I'd really thought strategically at the age of 25, I would have been going to Indonesian universities, talking to the Indonesian government, because I feel as though that's where I could have had it, but I didn't. Mistake number 17 in my life. But that's what I would have done if I'd had my time again. And I know many of the people in this room invest a lot of time and effort in countries that they don't live in now, which is good. But you can only do one or two. You can't do a lot. You can't build relationships with public servants and politicians in 10 countries. It's impossible.
That was excellent, Hugh. So my question is just, you couched everything you said there in the context of economic values, yet at the end you highlighted the importance of kind of local-based conservation. And I'm just wondering whether, a lot of conservation, how much effort should actually be invested in kind of more connecting people with the local environment rather than focusing on the kind of country level economics, because I mean, I work in Hawaii, where a lot of the problems cannot be solved. I mean, at the moment, however much money you pour at something, it's not going to work. And so the most successful project there is actually a homegrown effort where they've actually got recovery in the forest. So to what extent would you balance that kind of, the kind of grassroots efforts versus?
I think they're all good. I mean, I think they're all good. And I mean, one of my activities is I'm president of the Friends of Oxley Creek Common, and there's 100 hectares, and we're trying to stop it being developed. And now we're trying to get it built into a bird sanctuary. And we've been working on that for 24 years, and we've got almost nowhere. So we stopped it being developed. It wasn't turned into soccer fields for private schools, but we haven't got it into a bird sanctuary yet. So yeah, plant trees, do weeding. So I tend to agree. It's best to ground yourself in local projects, council projects. To be honest, I'll do anything anywhere that I think I can be useful. I mean, it's economics, you're right, but it's not cost benefit analysis. So I've sort of come to assume that my budget's fixed from philanthropy and government, and I'm there for trying to get another 20 or 30% by being efficient. So this is an efficiency formula. Whereas, the big economic argument, which is, the question you asked, is surely some of these things are actually profitable in true, broader economic terms. And I must admit, I have shied away from that because I just think it's a very interesting, but it's a difficult problem. So I've gone to, as somebody said, you spend a lot of time working on efficiency rather than sufficiency. So given people are budget constrained, time and money constrained, and so yes, it's not the whole problem. I think those people who work on the bigger macroeconomic questions and can get governments to spend more money on the environment is great. I just haven't seen it happen. I mean, maybe in the EU a little bit, but every state in Australia has reduced their environment spending over the last 40 years, regardless of the fact the green movement's grown. So I really find I find that baffling, because how does democracy work? It hasn't worked in terms of allocation. The only other thing I'd say is most of the Western economies, I understand, all their surplus profit has gone into health, and it's hard to fight health. So Australian spends 40% of its federal money on health and another 30% on disability and aged care. That's the bulk of our prosperity of the Western world is just poured into health because we're living a long time and we expect ridiculously high health standards. And everything else has suffered. Education, environment, yeah, unfortunately. And I don't, it's not very easy to fight health, is it? That's not an argument I like going into. Or we could form a movement of how do you actually end your life cheaply? That's a new thing. You know, how do you phase out from life cheaply? Because that's so much money goes into the last year of most people's lives, regardless of whether they live 100 or 60, so much money in that last year of life. So yes, that's a new club we can form. Cheap dying. Yeah.
Professor, you touched on, in the end, biodiversity credits that you're working on.
Yes.
I work in carbon credits.
Yes.
And I think the fact that there's a possibility that it can turn, you know, biodiversity into a commodity going forward. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is sort of working for carbon. I have to say in Australia, our carbon market with the Australian carbon credit market has partially worked, but it's also, there's some spectacular failures. So again, several people, Megan Evans included, has shown that a lot of our carbon credits are really they're not additional. They haven't really been fixing carbon above and beyond background rates, and they may not even be material. So our carbon price, you know, has gone from $30 to $100 and back to $20 and $50 and wandering erratically around. It's not a great market, is it? I mean, would you buy shares in a bank that's value tripled overnight because of scandals and policy change? So I hope the carbon markets are getting tighter. All the regulations and the rules and the auditing of carbon is getting better and the carbon market stabilises. But I expect in the biodiversity markets, I expect 10 years of chaos. So I know that sounds depressing. I expect 10 years of chaos. And I mean, you can't expect these markets to work perfectly instantly. Financial markets, which we've been working on for 2,500 years or 3,000 years, there's corruption, there's fraud, you know, there's ridiculous things going on. Interest rates in New Guinea might be 20% and Argentina might be 50% and in Japan they're 1%. So I can take £20 and I can go and buy 10 times as much food in some countries than I can buy here. So money's not fungible. Financial markets don't even make any sense and companies go broke and people get put in jail for fraud. So I think as scientists, we assume we'll create a biodiversity market where there'll be no mistakes, no errors, no bad players, nothing at all. And I think that's the mistake as academics we make, or kind of that we think that we should over-engineer. We just have to do it and chaos will happen. Bad things will go wrong. There will be fraud. There'll be lots of bad things, but then we'll plug the holes with rules and laws and accountants and different kinds of systems, and eventually I'm assuming it's going to work. Which, yeah, there you go. It's exciting, isn't it? But it's just not the way it's not like developing the curriculum for first year mathematics, which is a more regulated issue.
Any more questions?
Just following up on this discussion, in principle, there's an equivalence between a Maxent planning solution and market rules. So you can invent market rules for trading that basically generate the same solution as a Maxent planning tool. And I think the only difference is the dirtiness of implementation and how corrupt people are to, you know, in the design of the market rules or in the implementation of a planning solution. So it's basically the politics mess it up.
I think you're right. And also, you know, you can have perfect top-down spatial planning rules about protected areas and zoning. You can have perfect rules about allocation of funding to conservation projects, but it still won't work perfectly. Things will go wrong. So the top-down government control things, they're very expensive, you know, and we have found that in general, in our carbon markets, in our biodiversity markets, if there's too much government control and too much government investment, and they're a big player in the markets don't work, because the last thing you want is governments should just make the rules and do the regulation and put in the checks and balances through the system and make sure that, you know, the judiciary and the politics are all independent sources and there's freedom of speech and information. That's what governments should do. What we're often finding in Australia, governments try and create markets, but then they themselves actually involve buying credits. I mean, we've got them buying carbon credits, we've got them buying biodiversity credits, but, you know, it's like that. It's a bit too much like, I suppose, without being pejorative, a bit like the Chinese economy. The government is very involved in buying and selling and propping up the market. So they create a market, they appear to be a market, appear to be a capitalist system running on markets, but in fact, they're manipulating those markets, aren't they? We see that. They're building flats that nobody lives in to drive the economy. And I think that's a dangerous thing to do. So most of the people I know who care about the carbon biodiversity market say, governments get away, make the market should run. And then when you see things going wrong, fix the regulations and the rules and the auditing. Don't you yourself start investing money in the market.
I'll wrap up with one. So in your talk, Hugh, you veered from between good news stories and bad news stories in your experience in Australia. And I'm just wondering at the end of it, if you're just thinking about Australia, looking over the last 30 years, how, if you had to give a percentage to your success, how much do you think you've achieved over what you would like to have done or would like to have seen happen, you and your colleagues collectively, not just you individually? That's it.
That's right.
Yeah, collectively. As
well,
a
actually,
community.
so I'm going to dodge the question. All I know that doing things is better than not doing things. So that's rather than the percentage, I know that by doing more, I'll get more done. When it will happen and if it will happen, I don't know. So I would say, I think the environment movement, the green movement in Australia, like the green movement in Europe and the United Kingdom, suffers from burnout and depression. And I have to say that most of my postdocs and PhD students and NGO colleagues say, why do you remain so optimistic? And I'd say I'm delusional and not well adjusted.
Okay, we'll take that. We'll take that.
That's right. So
and well dodged.
Because there's nothing else you can do. You know, in the end, you wake up and you do stuff.
Yeah.
Don't think about the big. So I'm refusing to answer your question because I don't want to answer it.
Okay.
Because it's too depressing.
So we'll take that as well dodged. Okay. Great. Well, thank you. That was definitely unforgettable. As one of our seminars. So thank you for your time.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
We have drinks around the corner. Atmosphere room, is it?